there was a large non-communist left in Europe which bought into the social into the social cultural rights. So the fourth point then, what I wanted to argue, and I think I've tried to argue in a sustained way throughout the course, is that these are not in some sense separate, because economic and social and cultural rights are probably not sustainable without a political system in which civil and political rights exist. And I wanted to say that's particularly true in cases where there's actually real important divides in a society, and there's probably no divide more important than the divide of gender. So women have now made a claim for women's rights, but in order to, and we talked about the Beijing conference, we saw some films from the Vienna conference, and we've periodically talked about the question of women's rights, because if there's sort of one group in Western history, I mean world history, whose rights have been more fully expressed, who've gone essentially from being some version of property to being some version of persons, it's women. And you see this in the international arena. We saw this in a variety of contexts, and we talked about it periodically in the course. And it's the lack of political power by women and civil rights by women has real economic and social consequences. So a stage, I would want to argue, if you would have argued in the course, these are not separable issues. The idea of producing a just and humane polity requires not just a commitment to social, political, and economic rights, social, cultural, and economic rights, but requires that the people working for this also have civil and political rights. And I think we've seen this periodically in the course. So yes, I've acknowledged that there are these two issues, that they are sometimes seen to be in juxtaposition, but I've tried to suggest that they're in fact, in real life, not in juxtaposition. So, fifth point that I've tried to suggest. I've argued, and I didn't do this in the previous course, so this is sort of a new thinking from that there have been systematic rejection of human rights claims on a variety of ideological and historical grounds. So I talked to you about Marxism, and I talked to you about the notion that you would not need human rights in a proletarian society because what they call the division in the self, the opposition between the state and the individual, and between a class, and the economic inequality is a consequence of a particular bourgeois liberal order. And if that bourgeois liberal order ended, and if one lived in the world of a proletarian dictatorship, there would in fact be no such conflict. And individual interests and public interests would coincide, and you wouldn't need this human rights system. You wouldn't need to make these claims. And I've tried to suggest to you that in real life, that doesn't work out this way, and there were some very sort of disastrous consequences. And we read the Custer book and talked about the trials that followed from these kinds of claims about history and philosophy. We also talked about fascism, and it's a radical communitarian claims, which say that certain people are excluded. We talked about civilization claims, imperialism, and we talked about the Congo, in which terrible things were done in the name of the struggle of civilization. We talked about racist claims, the miscegenation question, where people were systematically excluded from what seemed to be a pretty fundamental right on the basis of race. What I've suggested about this is that while these different sort of claims stood in opposition to the universal human rights issue, and some of them, like some of the imperialist things, were actually by people who claimed to adhere to bourgeois human rights issues. I mean, you would call this hypocrisy. I also suggest that human rights language has offered a systematic response to these counterclaims. So the point of the Congo example was a case in which I tried to say, yes, it's European, the banner of European civilization that these horrible things were done in the Congo, but it's also under the banner of human rights and civilization that the notion of a crime against humanity is invented and that the struggle against it is predicated. So the human rights discourse, this universal human rights discourse, has provided a way of countering these anti-universal claims. And that there's always, and in each of these debates, there have been historically two sides. So with the same day we read Fanon, we read people from the Bandung Conference who had very different views on these issues. These are contested issues. And I've tried to suggest, contrary to our guest recently, the lecture before last, that this isn't a discussion between the West and the rest, but a discussion within the West. I mean, Russia and Germany and the United States are all perfectly Western, and Bandung is not Western. That these are debates that go on within different world regions and within different political communities. So, though I acknowledged early in the course that the legal language of human rights is a Western legal language, that in fact adherence to these versions in the last 100 years has not been. It's specifically a Western versus someone else, but much more complex politically and socially and geographically. And I just show you that within the West, there were these debates. So one of the earliest humanitarian human rights organizations, the Aboriginal Protection Society, 1849, and it was ridiculed by other Europeans as saying, you can't have human rights to these savages. They're beasts, right? So you have these two positions in Europe. And of course you have the other position, I mean the kind of the them and us position. So it doesn't sort of slice up, even at any given time, one way or the other. And there's sort of complicated in-between figures like David Livingstone, whom I talked to you about briefly, who's seen by some as an imperialist bringing Christianity, forcing Christianity on the natives of Africa, and by others, if I quote a lot of natives, who adored the guy. We didn't talk about this in great detail, but he's is a complex figure in these relationships who could be and has been interpreted both by African historians and by Western historians in very different ways. We also then talked about ways in which these exclusions were created by sort of a kind of producing another group of people who didn't count as human. And we talked about the history of racism, both in the United States and in Europe more generally. And we talked about cases in which this anti-human rights discourse in communism produces these kinds of trials that we've talked about. So there were real consequences of this anti-human rights, and there was real battles against anti-human rights. So it was a dialogue which I've tried to talk to you about before. This is the Gulag example, which we were just, you don't have to, this will be on the PowerPoint, but we've shown you all of these. Just to remind you of our story, the fight between the fascists and the communists, and the sort of bitter of two different forms of, if you will, of not having a universal cosmopolitan human rights notion. The guys who were beasts are the communists, or the guys who were beasts are the fascists. Take your pick. In neither of these, death to Marxism. That's not a. I'm not going to do all this detail. One folk, one Führer, one Reich. Is this sort of giant communitarian position in which certain sorts of people were systematically included, Jews most famously, but other sorts of people, Slavs, other sorts of people as well, in a kind of European imperial project, internal to Europe, as a German imperial project on the continent of Europe. We talked about the racist version of these Nuremberg laws which set up race, which excluded people, handicapped people, and set up euthanasia campaigns. Obviously against Jews. Don't buy at this Jewish store. Don't sit on this only Jews can sit on this bench. And of course, we have a version of this in some version of the American South in my lifetime. I mean, I lived with this. So really, it's sort of hard for us to get our heads around it, but it was commonplace, yes. No. Well, it may seem strange, but they may. Look, you got to remember this is a highly integrated, certainly at the bourgeois level, a highly integrated Jewish population. So some high percentage, 43% of doctors in Berlin were Jewish. Jews were more integrated in the universities than anywhere else in Europe. There was more intermarriage anywhere else in Europe. So if you want to produce a racially, culturally separate group of people, you in some sense had to insist that even those people who wanted to, that you had to create separatism. And we have lots and lots of evidence where every so often even people in the SS wanted to be nice to Jews, and there was a lot of there was considerable propaganda and pressure not to be. In other words, it was a large ideological project. So it may seem strange to us, but in fact it was very systematic. It was systematic in the American South, and of course in Europe we know it had these terrible consequences: the Gulag on one side, the concentration camps on the other side. Okay, so the sixth point, I guess, the media and all its modes have played a crucial part in the history and practice of human rights, and that's why we've looked at so many different kinds of sources. I know that you guys are all going to complain in your evaluations you have too much reading. I'm not even going to apologize for it. I warned you. But the point is that I wanted you to sort of understand this development of human rights from a variety of different perspectives through which it was made manifest over the last couple hundred years. So we looked at pictures, we looked at some movies, we read some novels, we looked at reports, right? We did a whole bunch, a wide range of international conference reports, newspapers, and so forth. And I've tried to suggest to you that publicity and narratives and the form in which this is put forward matters a lot. And you could see this yourselves when you start seeing these movies, both documentary movies, movies of conferences, interviews. All these ways in which we come to take the claims of other people seriously and come to want to do something about them and learn how we can do something about it. And remember, I gave you these examples of this in foreign policy, and particularly how these issues of the so-called atrocities in Bulgaria make their way into the public actually has effect on policy. So it's not just, I'm not just making up the narratives and point that actually had political consequences and still has political consequences. And it's there for the opposition. So this is an Egyptian anti-imperialist cartoon which also makes its way around, how the great civilizers live on a mountain of skulls. So on all sides, publicity is hugely important. And it's also, it's widespread publicity. These are all cheap forms of communication. And just to remind you, one of the most famous tracts, the ones against the Leopold in the Congo by E.D. Morel, and we read a little bit of his report, and we read a little bit of George Washington Williams, the black American journalist and educator who I remember coined the phrase crimes against humanity and was a leader in the campaign against Leopold in the Congo. Best-selling novel on Arthur Koestler, the Frantz Fanon translated into many different languages. In other words, this is a very media-rich discourse that we've been talking about. I think the most widespread photographic exhibition in probably the world history, The Family of Man, which made all of Europe, coffee table book, which translated into 30 languages, exists everywhere, and so forth. So my point in just reminding you of all this is to say, how does these principles that we began in the late 18th century become universally discussed and come to be understood as universal? The answer is through all these kinds of this media, through these forms of narrative, through photographs, and through all these sort of modes, not just through classes and ideas, though those matter as well. Popular magazines. This just reminds you of the sort of things we've been talking about in the course. Then we periodically had sections. We talked with several lawyers. We've talked about the Universal Declaration. We did a lot on international, thank you, a little note, international covenants. And what I wanted to argue, I think, is the seventh, that international covenants and national constitutions have played a crucial role in the articulation and enforcement of human rights. And human rights have played a part in many nations' foreign relations, although the real possibility of this has been much debated between realists and idealists. So there are human rights